currently suspended.
Order, order. This is the Digital Cultural Media and Sports Select Committee. This is our second panel today in the sustainability of local journalism. We are joined for our second panel by Matt Abbott, Deputy Director, the Independent Community News Network, George Brock, Chair of the Charitable Journalism Project, and Polly Perkins, the Editor of Burngreave Messenger. Hello, Polly, Matt and George. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you. Our first question is going to come from Clive Efford.
So, welcome. Thank you for coming to give evidence to us. My first question is about multi-title groups. Is it good news or bad news if local news is bought out by a multi-title group? Any one of you would like to go first?
Experience is generally telling us, I'm sure Matt will have more to say, that the consequences are generally negative. They're negative because on the average, on the overall, the investment in reporting and locally from local communities tends to shrink. That's the overall picture. And you've heard quite a lot of evidence on this already. I'm sure Matt wants to add.
Absolutely. I think when multi-title organisations consolidate their operations, what happens is journalists are removed from local areas. There is less local reporting. It's more generic reporting that happens within those communities. And communities suffer directly because of that, and democracy suffers directly because of that too.
I think that people who live in an area understand the nuance of the communities in that area in a way that someone who doesn't live in that area or doesn't work physically in that area can't possibly hope to. So I can't see any positives to it other than that when stuff's like that online, they can measure the clicks that come through advertising. And of course, the big secret about advertising is there is no evidence that it works. And the only way that advertisers can hook on and say this works is that they're getting clicks, but they don't actually know that that translates to sales. So,
right. So can, in the current climate where we're seeing fewer and fewer people buying the actual physical newspaper, more and more people getting their news online, so can local independent news become financially sustainable in the current market?
I think it certainly can become sustainable. It needs a lot of support. There's multiple ways that support can be delivered into the sector. There could be government support, there could be state support in terms of subsidies, in terms of innovation funds, like the Future News Fund that was developed after the Cairncross Review. That needs to be a bit more far-reaching and a little bit more targeted into the sector. But there are multiple different business models within the sector. There are print models, there are digital models, there are newsletter models, particularly the new Substack model that has come about. So whenever there is a solution that's talked about, there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all. There needs to be multiple revenue streams, and businesses need to diversify their revenue streams in order to succeed.
And when you say diversified, give us are you talking about a mixture between a printed form and online? What do you?
No, not necessarily. I mean, in terms of, I think advertising still has a really valuable role to play in local journalism. I think that many of our members are based in their communities in such a way that they attract that local advertising from those local businesses, and there is a really strong relationship between local businesses and the newspaper or the online site that they have, and that needs to be kind of propped up in some way. That needs to be supported. That they can continue to produce the journalism within that community using the advertising from those local communities, from those local businesses, which was very lacking during the lockdown as all of those local businesses closed down. But they also need to get revenue streams from elsewhere, whether that be membership models or subscription models, or through the looking at the legislation surrounding statutory public notices, or through legislation surrounding public health advertising, which was again severely lacking during COVID. The independent sector didn't get anything during COVID. 95% of our members, in fact, received zero support during COVID.
All right.
I think the business model for local news can work, but it is toughest at local because that classified advertising that once sustained it, cars, jobs and houses, is all gone. It's not going to come back. And that means that people are experimenting. And digital also demolishes the barriers between all the platforms, between video and audio and print, words, like. And people are experimenting. So the diversification of what is occurring, particularly where people are innovating and experimenting, is extraordinary. And it will, and I think it will improve business models as they go. The advertising model in the big cities isn't doing so badly. It's very tough in small towns. Very tough, probably the toughest of all. But people will find things, I'm sure, as time goes on. But it needs a bit of pump priming and help in the meanwhile.
And Polly, you said about it's easier for people to measure what goes on in terms of advertising online because they can get the clicks. So does that create a trade-off between independent news and the need to get those clicks?
I presume so, but we don't have any advertising on our digital platforms, so I'm not the right person to ask about that.
Right.
But the first question you asked about whether it can be sustainable in the current model, and I think what we actually heard then was no from both of these people, because they both talked about needing to change the model and needing for there to be other ways of being sustainable, if what we actually mean by sustainability is only financial sustainability. And I think there's no way under the current model that local journalism can be sustainable without the government's intervention. I think not.
Okay, and in terms of the social impact of local news organisations, how unique would you say is the service that they provide? I mean, again, any one of you wants to go first?
I think
then. Sorry,
Polly, go on. I should probably.
The social impact of the Burngreave Messenger is absolutely enormous for our area. We've got massive digital deprivation in Burngreave. It's one of the most deprived wards in the country. It's in the top 10%. And, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the people in our community simply would not have known where to go and get vaccinated, would not have known where to go and get tested, and we could let them know. And this lands on everyone's doorstep. So there's no question of the people in Burngreave knowing where to get vaccinated and tested. It also meant we could carry articles written by members of vaccine-reluctant communities about why people should get vaccinated. So we were able to carry really valuable health messaging that couldn't otherwise be carried. The other thing that was being mentioned earlier was young people getting into journalism. One of the things I've done is that the centre section is now made by youth groups and schools in our area. So young people are doing journalism. And it's getting out into their homes, and it means that they're speaking to each other and to other adults across the catchment area divide. So that's one of the things that a charity hyper-local newspaper can do that I don't think is available, certainly not to national newspapers, and would be very difficult to be affordable for other local journalism that isn't charity-led.
One of the ways of looking at what the social impact is to look at it where it's really gone worst. If you see what I mean. We did a research project recently, the Charitable Journalism Project. We called it Local News Deserts in the UK. And that takes 7 places in the UK where local news provision is particularly poor. And essentially, social media have taken over. That tells the story just in one sentence. There's more detail, of course, but and therefore it is extremely difficult to build cohesion in communities, to sustain local democracy, to hold accountable the local powers, not necessarily only councils, but other institutions and authorities. It's just much harder to do if there's not proper reporting going on.
If I may,
Yeah, yes.
Independent community news reporters as well are often the only journalists within those areas, providing that democratic value, providing that citizen engagement. They're there covering those council meetings, they're covering those election hustings. There aren't any other journalists in those in some of these areas that George talks about. There are no others. All of the big multi-title organisations are pulled out of those areas, consolidating their operations, in some cases counties away. So it leaves these areas bereft of any journalists, apart from these independent journalists who have stepped in, and they're taking over this role alongside the local democracy reporters that have been drafted in by the BBC. If it wasn't for them, those councils and those organisations and those public bodies wouldn't be held to account at all, and the local communities wouldn't have any access to information. One of the areas not talked about in George's study, but which is a news desert in Wales, where the Independent Community News Network is based, is in Port Talbot. And there was a news project called the Port Talbot Magnet, which was developed after there was previously about 15 journalists in Port Talbot, and they all kind of just disappeared over a course of a decade. You know, the newspapers pulled out, and so they had nothing left. So they started the Port Talbot Magnet. Unfortunately, it wasn't a success because of the stark deprivation in the area of Port Talbot. You know, they tried to run a membership model, they tried to run a reader revenue model, but it wasn't successful. But before they actually went in there and produced this publication, it was found in a PhD thesis that people were getting their news from graffiti that was perhaps, you know, daubed under a bridge, that a road had been closed. Nobody knew that this road had been closed, and it was reported in this PhD thesis that people found out about it because of things like that.
I mean, that's fascinating. So I think you partly answered the next question, but it's about the social impact comparison between local news and national news, and what the difference is. There a significant difference, would you say?
I would say so. Yes, absolutely. National news doesn't necessarily cover what's going on in local communities. It potentially occasionally parachutes in when there's a big news story that's happening. But a lot of the time, those local news stories go under the radar. They're only reported within those small communities. But if there was no local news reporting covering those events, then local councils, they'd just be left unchecked, and nobody would be making sure that they were doing their job properly, and there was no corruption going on. Because then those national news journalists are only going to jump in when there's a sexy news story happening, you know, whether there's a scandal or something like that.
Yeah, but I mean, I've been in local government myself, and I've been an MP for a long, long time, and so local news is clearly of interest to me, and sometimes I like to make it, but you know, it's for good reasons. But sometimes, you know, I do despair of some of the stories that get written, because they are written they're by a local journalist that seems to think that he's working for the Sun, or that it's a shock horror story. So it tends to sort of have a bias to saying that the council's always inefficient, wasting money, not very good. You know, slightly tongue in cheek, but always knocking. Which has a big impact on local opinion, but doesn't actually tell, you know, the true story. No one writes a story that says shock horror, the council was very efficient today. You know, but how much does local news distort local opinion and influence outcomes?
I think that's the role of journalism, though, isn't it? It's always going to be quite combative when it comes to people that are in power. That's just journalism for you, and I think it's always going to be that way. And I think that's a good thing, because it does hold those people that do hold on to the purse strings and to the reins of power. It holds those people in check, and I think that's definitely a valuable thing. And I do think journalism does move the conversation forward when it comes to things like local politics, and I think that's a vital thing as well.
Journalism should always be wary about how power is being used, but one of the most interesting things about the independent, often non-profit publications that are coming up now is that they take seriously their business of building the community. And that means that they can't be permanently snarky, because they're in the community, they're living in the community, they're doing things in the community. And while they want, no doubt, local council or whatever it is to be accountable and to be people to be aware of what it's doing, good or bad, they can't just be relentlessly negative.
No, okay.
And that's a very clear trend, I think.
Right.
I think
Are
that's
you relentlessly negative about your local authority?
No, absolutely not. And I think that's also a pressure that if what we mean by independence is being dependent on finance from advertising, that's a pressure that I would say is associated with advertising rather than with journalism. I think you can write journalism that's both valuable and positive about local government. Obviously, you have to hold local government to account, and local government ought to be doing that for itself as well. But I think in the Burngreave Messenger, part of our job is to try and do some of the celebratory work as well, and say these are some of the really great things happening in your city that you can access that you're not going to hear about from anywhere else.
Right.
And because we work in a deprived area, we haven't got any wealthy people who are going to set up a little newsletter to impress their mates, you know, that's going to tell people what's going on in the local area. So it has to be done through us, because if we don't tell the stories, no one's going to. And our in Sheffield local papers only tell negative stories about Burngreave because those are the ones that will sell.
Yes.
Because people empathise a lot more with a sad story or an angry story than they do with a positive one.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out as well that the independent media sector, the independent news sector, they're not just reporting on those council meetings. Like Polly said, they're doing the park runs every Sunday. They're doing those community profiles. They're doing those stories about those people within their community that would never be reported on. And it's always nice to see your neighbour in the newspaper. You know, it makes you feel part of that community. It makes you feel more actively engaged and willing to take part. So.
And frankly, we're doing quite a lot of the job of local government as well by letting people know what the opportunities are available to them. They're certainly not hearing it from our local government. There is no platform other than in Burngreave to let people know about stuff. Local governments can't afford to do a leaflet run for every event they have on, but they can just give us a call and get us to put it in the paper or get us to put it on our social media.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Rupert Huck.
Thanks. Yeah, just got a couple on philanthropic funding to local journalism. You hear in America of the Carnegie Foundation and people like that. In this country, it's not so developed. I think for a while you saw a sad hangdog face of Jimmy Wales on Wikipedia saying, "Give us your money." And when you go on The Guardian, there is a thing to get beyond that you can donate. Why is it? But yeah, that is the nearest we know of here. I think the Liverpool Echo was a Reach PLC title that had a donation drive. And again, some of our local titles, I can think of Ealing Today, I think they've got a suggested donation of, it says same as a cappuccino every week or something. Why is it philanthropic funding of journalism is less prevalent in the UK than other countries like the US?
The Charitable Journalism Project works on exactly this issue, and we would like to see more organisations, more local newsrooms to apply and succeed and registering as charities, which would give them a great advantage. There is perhaps more money sloshing around in the American system than may ever slosh around in the British system, but if they're registered as charities, they can take donations large and small. There's a tax break, and there's a reputational gain as well. If you're a registered charity, obviously, you're regulated. As far as I know, the Burngreave Messenger is the only local news provider registered as a charity. There's been some shift of attitude on the part of the Charity Commission recently. They've publicised the decision to register as a charity the Public Interest News Foundation, and they registered Charitable Journalism Project as well. And we think that they are starting to think more flexibly about this, but we would like to see this opening wider and more publications go through it. Wouldn't suit every local publication to do that, but we think there are really quite a lot, and our next project will probably be to look at exactly what this number is. We think there are quite a few local news projects which would gain from this and could, strengthen their evidently often very ropey finances.
So we think it's because there's a different tradition in the US why they do it more there than...
Well, I think there's some difference in tradition, but there is also an important regulatory difference as well here. It's very, very difficult in practice for local news organisations to get registered as charities. No. Firstly, that I'm sitting next to the representative, the only one that we know of, A. B, it requires expensive, long, difficult application. Now, we're also trying to raise a fund to help legally people to do this. Let me give you one example. There's an independent publication in Guildford called the Guildford Dragon News, and they're going to apply to be registered as a charity. Their application is just on its way in at the moment, but it has required some expert help from a specialised lawyer to get them to that point. So it's not an easy process, and it can be very slow too.
I mean, just to the three of you, if you could wave a magic wand, what would it take, what mechanism, what could be done at governmental level to unlock philanthropic funding? So sounds like you're saying people can register as a charity, or I don't know, if there was some tax break that,
Well, in a one-sentence solution, you could put a clause in the media bill establishing journalism as the 14th charitable purpose in the Charities Act.
Okay, anyone else?
I'm not sure how relevant philanthropy would be in an area as deprived as Burngreave, because I think my suspicion is that philanthropists in general will be wealthy older white men who will require their peers to be happy with their philanthropy, and so therefore will do it in an area their peers live in, so that it can be witnessed. You know, I'd be very surprised to see someone wealthy wanting to provide funds for me to keep running the Burngreave Messenger in a deprived area. I just don't see that happening. I think most people's motivation is emotional and selfish, you know, because that's what humans tend to be.
But can I just add one thing to that? If the Burngreave Messenger is applying to philanthropic funds, it is established as a charity. That makes it easier for those funds to give.
Sure, they just have to want to as well.
Yeah.
I think the government's got a role as well in kick-starting that process, in providing those incentives, and like George says. But I think that needs to be a very limited and almost kind of like a seed funding process to kick-start that process going, you know, so that the government encourages those organisations to start investing in the sector.
I do think it should be a matter of commitment to local democracy, that people can be informed and people who don't have access to broadband can be informed. If we're not going to make broadband free for everyone, then we at least have to provide information for everyone. So I do think there should be state funding for hyper-local journalism. I don't actually see a problem with that in terms of, I guess the suggestion in the last panel was that that might become propagandist. I don't see why that's any more dangerous than being dependent on advertisers, you know.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. James Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to turn to the BBC's Local Democracy Reporter service. Our committee's heard a variety of views on it, and I'd like to ask you, is this still a viable way to get that local news out there? Polly, do you want to start your views?
I think we can't access it because our journalists are volunteers, but what I know from our local radio station that do access that is that it's not very useful to them because they just get text, and you can't just put text on a radio. So I think it needs to be multimedia. And what I would like to see is that the local papers are then, so if there's charity journalism papers in a city, that then the local for-profit papers 2p those BBC local journalism journalists to us, so that we can benefit from it.
Thank you.
I think the LDR scheme is viable and good as far as it goes. It just doesn't go very far. It's not really a secret that when the BBC started it, what they hoped was that the very big high-tech firms would come in with funds and massively expand it. And that didn't happen. The report on local news deserts, records that they do make a difference where they are. Some of the limitations that Polly has mentioned, but it's a bit spotty. It's not everywhere.
Thank you, Matt. Do you have any?
I think, in principle, I think that the LDR scheme is great. I think that it does some really valuable work within communities. We have 120 plus members of ICNN, independent organisations, and I think there are somewhere around the region of 165 LDRs in the country. More than half of our members, in fact probably 3/4 of our members, receive content from the LDR scheme, and they say it does add value to their product and then to their offering. It's not without its faults, obviously. There are concerns over how much a reporter gets paid, for example. I mean, it's not a great deal. They are having trouble hiring people to do the LDR job. There's obviously the ongoing issue in Bristol at the moment with the LDR, who's been banned from covering the council, and a lot of other newspapers have boycotted the Bristol Council, which is good news to hear, because the LDRs are reporters, they are journalists, they're trained journalists, and they do an exceptional job. One of our members, in fact, left his publication behind to join the LDR scheme last year, and he's now making a real successful go of it. But again, as George said, it's not far-reaching enough. It doesn't cover everything that it needs to cover. It doesn't cover magistrates' courts, as far as I'm aware, and there are problems as well within the way the contracts work. ICNN was set up initially. We actually set up the Independent Community News Network as a way to get our members' voices heard at the discussions with the NMA and the BBC when the LDR scheme was first being created. And a lot of our members can't actually have a contract to employ one of these local democracy reporters because they're not big enough. So it was never really built with small independent team organisations in mind. But now that they do have access to it, and there are, I think our members employ perhaps a dozen of these local democracy reporters themselves. But then again, having the reporter embedded in your newsroom provides you with an advantage over other organisations. Being able to talk to that journalist on a daily basis, being able to advise them on what stories are best to cover, which isn't necessarily within the remit of the local democracy reporter scheme, can create some issues.
Thank you. And finally, just to come back, are there any other improvements or changes to that scheme that you would recommend to support that independent community news sector? Polly, you mentioned finance and coming down. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any other changes?
Only that we can't access it, and we'd love to.
Yeah. George?
I mean, if it could be expanded, that would be great. But it would it does need to do more, both going downwards in terms of size and breadth in terms of covering more places.
And multimedia as well.
And multimedia as well.
Matt, any final?
I just think that the contracts themselves need to be looked at thoroughly and to make sure that they are being operated properly by the organisations running them. You hear a lot of stories about the reporters covering things that aren't necessarily within their remit, precisely because they're being employed by one of these multi-title organisations. They're covering stories and they're doing vox pops and things like that, which aren't necessarily vital or important.
So better focus, the pay needs.
I think so, yeah. I think so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Giles Watling.
Yeah, I'm going to be very short, very quick here, because a lot of my questions were answered already. I think it's brilliant that your Burngreave Messenger managed to achieve charitable status. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, and we talked about earlier about the difficulties with legislation on that. But it just occurred to me that when I was a councillor many years ago, and we had a newspaper that the council published, and that newspaper used to use journalists. But of course it wouldn't be holding the council to account in perhaps a way you'd like it to, but it covered local stories and news stories, factual stuff like that, and also it told everybody what was going on in the local area, what the council was doing, and events and so forth. And I wouldn't like to put the Burngreave Messenger out of business, but I'd just like to get your views on that sort of publication. Is it valuable? Because we discontinued it back in 2007, 2008, because everybody was looking online, things were changing, and it was costing quite a lot of taxpayer money to produce. I just wonder what your views would be on that. Polly, for you first.
Well, I think you've done a disservice by abandoning that to anyone in your area that doesn't have access to digital media. And you might be surprised at quite how many people in Britain that is, but it's not a small percentage. And also, people were talking earlier, kept saying, oh, I like the feeling of holding a paper. Mm-hmm. It's actually more complex than that. You don't just like the feeling of holding a paper. Different areas of your brain are lighting up and functioning when you hold something physical. Mm-hmm. When you look at something on paper, when you can interact by writing on something, a whole different thing is happening in your brain. There's whole learning centres that are being switched on that simply aren't switched on when you're looking on a device in the same way, So I think it is valuable. I'm not sure that something produced by the council with journalists who are prevented from holding the council to account can have equal value to something that can hold the council to account, but I think it is valuable. I think any information that's getting out there and telling people what's available to them is valuable, and the less of that there is, the greater the paucity in all of our knowledge about where we live.
No, just for the record, I was opposed to discontinuing the said newspaper. George, do you have any comment on those?
Well, as you know very well, some of the publications put out by councils were criticised for being rather propagandistic and misleading. And I don't think that print or digital is really the issue here. If you look at where it's bad in news deserts, what you find is that there is a lot of information coming out from major institutions and authorities, the police, the councils and so on. Most of it is coming out online. But the paradox, of course, is that with institutions much more able to communicate themselves than they used to be, the role of somebody independent looking at what they're doing is more important than ever. That's the paradox in a way. In this report about the news deserts, there are one or two really quite shocking examples of where people decided at a local level that a really quite important development was something better not debated in public. And because there weren't local media looking at it, it really kind of went under the radar.
Yeah.
Not 2 miles from here, there is a publication, independent, very local, extremely well embedded in its community, called SE1 News. That's SE1 as in Southeast 1. James Hatts, who started it 21 years ago, not long after he began, turned up in the public gallery of the council in that area, which happened to be discussing a multi-million-pound development project. And he went along thinking, I'm going to meet one or two of the local reporters who I haven't really come across yet, because this is potentially a very big story. He was the only person in the public gallery. And they were debating and deciding multi-million-pound development projects. And that's less than 2 miles from where we're sitting. So, accountability matters an awful lot.
Yes.
Even if institutions are communicating, as they are bound to do in the digital world, frequently and on their own account.
Okay, thank you.
I think it goes against the vital role of journalism as being the fourth estate. I think that councils have no right to be publishing their own information and publishing it in a print newspaper, for example, which directly competes with a local independent title, which seeks advertising from the same businesses and local organisations that the council paper is seeking advertising from.
Okay.
And there have been, I don't know if David Floyd is still here, but David Floyd and other organisations in London have been battling this issue for a long time. Councils shouldn't be publishing newspapers which seek to compete with local newspapers. Yet they're doing so, and they're breaking the law by doing so. They're doing it more frequently than they are allowed to do so. And I think there are still maybe one or two newspapers that are still doing that. Still council-run newspapers that do that. And if I'd just like to add one more thing, that occasionally MPs will put a letter through a flyer or a leaflet through my door, which looks on the face of it like a newspaper. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very disingenuous, and I don't think it helps journalism at all when advertising is propaganda, as I would call it, pretends to be journalism.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you. That concludes our session. Thank you very much, Matt Abbott, George Brock, and Polly Perkins for your evidence today. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.